I had written nearly 3,000 words that day, and in the afterglow of self-satisfaction, I decided that there was certainly something in this life of rural seclusion after all. In Bloomsbury, far too many people were acquainted with me and my address. They were just dropping in on me at all hours of the night and day, with complete disregard for my work. In their assumption, a writer was a person who never worked anyway. His stories were things he just dashed off in odd moments now and again, with no particular thought, as one dashes off letters. After a string of nights on short rations of sleep, trying to recover some of the time thus stolen from me during the day, I dashed off myself, away from London and these vampires of my attention, my friends. I took care that none of them, none but Spencer that is, should know my address until I was good and ready for them, and that meant when I had finished my novel. It was safe to tell Spencer. He never saw any of my other friends. They avoided him because he was odd, eccentric. In his musty bed sitting room in Mecklenburg Square, he lived in a world of his own. You sensed the strangeness as soon as you stepped into the room, and it was certainly enhanced by his presence. He was fattish, why I don't know, for I never saw him eat anything, and I believe older than he looked. He looked in his early 60s. Trying to maintain a conversation with him was indeed trying. You felt that quite 2/3 of his attention was somewhere else all the time, and he only intermittently remembered that you were there. And most of what he said to you he deliberately made cryptic. He had a tortuous mind that loved to puzzle and mystify. Many times I had remonstrated with him. For God's sake, Spencer, speak straightforwardly and sensibly, will you? I can make more sense out of my income tax correspondence than I can out of you. When you did make sense out of him, it was invariably worth the trouble. He had more odd knowledge tucked away inside his head than Ripley ever dreamed upon, and he was full of surprising little tidbits that made me exclaim, "That gives me an idea for a story." I made quite a lot of money out of Spencer in this way. Maybe that was why I looked upon him as my best friend. In fact, the main reason that I elected to keep in touch with him from my lonely cottage among the gorse and pines of Surrey was because my novel dealt with medieval witchcraft, and I anticipated difficulty over 1 or 2 chapters. I might need to dig into Spencer's fund of knowledge about such things. Also, he had the best library of books on the occult that I had ever come across. It was through a previous search for out-of-the-way information that I originally encountered him. But about that evening, when I was wandering alone across the Surrey Heath so comfortably satisfied with the day's work. It was an evening in midsummer, when the atmosphere was close and still, and the going of the sun had seemed to leave it more warm and oppressive than noonday. The air was a thick, almost liquid substance, from which your lungs were hard-pressed to draw oxygen, almost as thick as the blood which pumped at your temples and made your head throb heavily. Headachy weather, and you longed for a storm to come and break it up. Somewhere this night there was a storm, for along the horizon the sheet lightning flickered and jumped, and revealed silently weird-lit glimpses of an unsuspected cloudland that lay out there in the darkness. I don't know whether it's peculiar to me, but these strange, tense evenings of summer always set my imagination working more actively than the chilly autumn and winter nights beloved of the gothically romantic poets. Keats would begin in a drear-nighted December, and Poe's Ulalume would be carried to her tomb in the ghoul-haunted woodland of Weir on a night in the lonesome October. And as for the same gentleman's raven who quoth nevermore, distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December. No, the winter was merely physically uncomfortable. A hot, thundery night like this made me mentally uncomfortable. Uneasily, I sensed the imminence of something. I felt the electric charge slowly but unrelentingly building itself up in the air about me, forming something unknown but black and inimical, growing both in power and in consciousness of its power, awaiting with evil excitement the hour of its unleashing. Damn it, I thought, I've been thinking too much upon these things. This was the last novel I would write about the occult. The trouble with such an occupation was that the story becomes real to you as you write it, and you are disposed to picture warlocks and werewolves as things you might find in a dark corner of the coal cellar at some unlucky moment, especially when you have deliberately retired to solitude to get into your book. The glow of my self-esteem had now died somewhere among these unhealthy thoughts. I had walked too far and become overtired. The haven of my cottage seemed suddenly desirable, and I forced my heavy feet to quicken their lagging pace. Here now was the pine wood, like a blot of India ink on the lesser darkness of the night. 100 yards within it lay the cottage, But despite my impatience, they were the slowest 100 yards I traversed that night. Karin himself would have tripped over something in the pitch blackness of the wood. Nothing of the distant flickering of the lightning penetrated here. I had literally to feel my way along the path. Then all of a sudden I stopped in surprise, my hand on the bole of a pine. Somewhere ahead of me glimmered a faint patch of light, green light. As I watched it, it moved back and forth with a sort of dreadful, deliberate slowness. Then it stood still, and as I peered at it, I discovered a black cross, as it were, intersecting it. Abruptly, the light disappeared, and left me with the realization that the black cross had been the silhouette of the center of the cottage window's frame. Somebody, or something, was in the cottage. My heart started going like a two-stroke engine. Then the human habit of rationalizing unaccountable things came to the fore. It had been a firefly, or a jack-o'-lantern of marsh gas from the stagnant pond not far beyond the cottage. Or again, this was the sort of weather that generated those globes of ball lightning, which sometimes pop down chimneys and float around inside rooms. Or maybe a tramp was searching either for a bed for the night or for the money for one. But with a green light? I waited a while, but there was no return of the phenomenon. I hoped that whatever it was, it had gone away. Then I fumbled my way through the last few yards to the door and let myself in. In the darkness within, I lit a match, and by its feeble light surveyed the room. The words, "Is anybody there?" died in my mouth, for it was manifest that there was nobody. I conveyed the flame to the oil lamp, and the room became bright and cheerful. The shelves of books, still in their original colored dust jackets, gladdened my eye, as the sight of them always did, and the model galleon, the vase of marigolds, the shining pewter tankards, were all familiar and reassuring things. Nevertheless, I poured myself a scotch and soda before I settled down in the armchair by the tireless hearth to read over and polish the thousands of words I had scribbled that day. In the midst of my immersion in my own story of the burning of a particularly malignant witch, I suddenly noticed that the scalp muscles at the back of my head were taut and contracted, and that my hair must be bristling. And I felt in my mind what my body must have been aware of for some time, that there was some creature behind me and watching me with no friendly regard. Without seeming to divert my attention from my manuscript, I gazed up from under my brows at the mirror hanging above the fireplace. It showed the wall behind me empty, save for a framed watercolor of the Devil's Punch Bowl at Hindhead, which was just as it should be. With a relaxing of tenseness, I returned to my work, but only for a few moments. Some words I had written earlier in the story recurred to me. Vampires cast no reflection in mirrors. A little cold tremor passed over me. Then a spasm of fear-inspired anger at my childish timidity. Good Lord, to give a moment's credence to that Dracula claptrap. I swung round and positively glared behind me. There were no fearful fiends treading close behind me. There was nothing that had not been there before. Fool, I addressed myself bitterly, and began to turn slowly back. En route, as it were, my eye flickered past a brass warming pan hanging on the side wall, and then abruptly flicked back to it. For I had the impression of a dim and shapeless sort of face staring from its bright round surface. I sat and regarded it. Yes, there was certainly the effect of a face, an immobile, dead sort of face, like that of the man in the moon, and scarcely better defined. I got up to examine it, and it faded as I approached it, and quite disappeared when I got my nose within a yard of it, leaving just the empty surface of the pan. Yet when I sat back again in my chair, there it was once more, 2 round black holes of eyes, a beaky nose, a twisted gash of a mouth. Along the top of the sideboard, on the opposite side of the room to it, was an assemblage of objects of ornament and utility. Prominent among them were 2 ebony candlesticks, top-heavy things with round bulbous sockets for the candles. It was plain to me that the eyes of the face were simply the reflection of these 2 black balls, the nose a partial and distorted reflection of a vase, and the mouth probably a dent in the pan, which caught and held a content of shadow at this particular angle. I dismissed the matter, and returned again to my scribbled pages. In a little while I came to a passage that I judged needed wholly rewriting, and I stared thoughtfully before me while I endeavored to cast it afresh in my mind. Subconsciously at first, and then with a start of realization, I became cognizant that I was gazing straight at another face. It was in the carving of one of the pillars of the fireplace. From the coils of raised stone, ostensibly representing climbing vines, a demonic little visage regarded me with sharp, slanting, spiteful eyes, a vulpine face, like that of a fox, cornered and snarling. So alive and venomous did it seem that I instinctively moved back a little, with confused ideas of defensive measures. That slight movement was enough to make the illusion vanish. For it was an illusion, another trick of light. Yet though I experimented by changing my attitude in my chair, I could not get the effect to repeat itself. Indeed, I even became uncertain of the spot amid the intricacies of the carvings where it had seemed to appear. Not very surely, I returned to my business, but it was a long while before I could put those two faces from my mind. I had almost finished when that sickening feeling of being watched came over me again. For a little while I dared not raise my eyes from the papers that trembled in my hands. In my imagination it seemed to me that I was surrounded by a host of evil and silently threatening faces, that they leered and glowered, not only from the dark corners, but also from the bright surfaces of the things I had thought so homely and reassuring when I had come in from the outer darkness. When a sudden resolution to face them all and be damned to them, I looked up. I caught a fleeting impression of a huge face filling the whole wall of the empty alcove beside the fireplace, but the patches of discoloration from dampness that had apparently formed it seemed almost to shift apart in that instant and become wholly innocent and of no significance. I threw my papers down and jumped up with an oath. "What is this?" I demanded of myself. "Am I going mad? Or is something trying to drive me mad?" I went determinedly around the room, gazing straightly at all its contents in turn, but I saw nothing in the least out of the ordinary. Then I stood in the middle of the hearthrug and debated upon my state of affairs. Firstly, I had no further inclination to do any more work on my book tonight. I had had enough of pondering upon the sinister. Secondly, I wished either that I had company, or was in some less lonely spot in the countryside than I was. But outside the cottage was the wood, and outside the wood stretched the wide heath under the night sky, miles of black mystery between me and the nearest glow of humanity. Thirdly, despite my day's unusual mental and physical effort, I no longer felt tired. Nor did the thought of bed lure me. I felt that if I did sleep now, bad dreams, if nothing worse, would come. I decided that I would write some letters, just to hold, as I wrote them, the mental image of some of those exuberant friends of mine in London from whom I had fled, would provide something of a sense of company. It would give me a link with that pleasant world of every day, from which I was so utterly cut off in this stifling, electrically ominous night. The thought of letters caused me to wonder whether any had been delivered in the evening post while I had been out. I was already opening the little door of the letter cage when it occurred to me that I had deliberately withheld my address from all but Spencer. Nevertheless, I groped irrationally in the dark interior, and felt a little thrill of pleasure when my fingers encountered a letter, the only one. I felt something else, too, a mild shock which made those fingers tingle a bit. It was almost as if the letter had contained an electrical charge. I put it down to the atmosphere. The letter was from Spencer, as I might have guessed. It wasn't very helpful looked at from any point of view. He was in his most cryptic mood. It was in neat typescript, and began without any preamble. It was signed, "Yours faithfully," by Spencer, and that seemed to me almost the only comprehensible part of it. As for the rest, well, here it is, word for word, as I remember it. Ackle. The composer, Robert Schumann, long heard voices and saw things that were not there. He went mad. Angle. As did, in like manner, the author of Gulliver's Travels, Jonathan Swift. Agram. The poet, Shelley, was tormented all his life with dreams and visions. Once, in a waking vision, he encountered a figure shrouded in a dark cloak. It was himself. On another occasion, he heard a noise outside the country cottage where he was staying. He opened the door and was struck unconscious by something invisible. Ageron. When young, John Bunyan had fearful dreams and visions. Pestilent spirits and devils appeared to him until he reached the age of 17. Then they disappeared for 2 years, during which time he gave himself up to every evil passion and led a corrupt life. In 1651, his visions came again, and he said that he was hounded by the devil. He swore that he sometimes felt the tempter pull my clothes, and sometimes the devil took the form of a bull, bush, or besom. All the demons in the Pilgrim's Progress came out of his memories of these experiences. Alpha. William Blake, the poet and artist, had dreams and visions all his life. He left a record of not only how he saw the devil, but also how he drew him. He wrote, "I was going downstairs in the dark, when suddenly a light came streaming at my feet. I turned around, and there he was, looking fiercely at me through the iron grating of my staircase window. As he appeared, so I drew him." Blake's sketch showed a horrible phantom glaring through a grated window, with burning eyes, long teeth, and claws like talons. William Blake went mad. So, my friend, remember, while you are pent up in your little cottage, to beware of dreams and visions. No, decidedly not a cheering communication. I cursed the man for his perverted sense of humor, if this was supposed to be humor, and his maddening obscurantism. But it struck me as strange that the arrival of such an effort as this should coincide with a time at which I was seeing things. I sat down and studied the typed sheet with a frown. Ackle, Agram, Ageron, what gibberish words were these? What connection was there between them? If I guessed Spencer's twisted mind right, there was some link. Quite possibly he had put a clue in the wording. He was always searching for some such crazy but deliberate clues in the writings of Shakespeare to indicate that the plays were actually written by Francis Bacon. I went slowly through the wordage again. Why, I pondered, a capital P for pent? Wait a moment. Pentacle. Pentagram. I seized upon a volume of my encyclopedia, and sought what I soon found. This entry. Pentacle, pentangle, pentagram, pentageron, or pentalpha. These various names all belong to the design of a 5-pointed star, composed of 5 straight lines, which may be formed complete without severance of the tracing medium from the recording medium, i.e., it may be drawn without the pen being lifted from the paper, for the tip of the pen returns to its starting point. Possibly, for some such oddity as this, the sign has long been used as a mystical symbol, first by the Pythagoreans, and later by the astrologers and necromancers of the Middle Ages. It is found frequently in early ornamental art, and is still sometimes used, in superstitious regions of the world, on doorways to keep away witches and evil spirits. There followed representations of the pentacle, etc., and the hexagram, 2 interlaced equilateral triangles, with which it is often confused. While I had the P volume in my hand, I thought I might as well look up Pythagoras, of whom I knew nothing except that he had been a Greek philosopher with a theorem. His time, it appeared, was the 6th century BC, and he traveled around quite a lot, passing through Egypt among other places, and went to Italy in 529 BC, and founded there a religious brotherhood for the reformation of mankind, through practicing certain rites. Reaction against him began in his lifetime, and reached a head in the middle of the 5th century BC. His movement was violently trampled out. Meeting houses of Pythagoreans were everywhere sacked and burned, and Pythagoreans persecuted and slain. Well, all that was fairly interesting, I suppose, but I still didn't see any point to the letter. Yet there was still the coincidence of its arrival and my fit of the willies. I lay back in my chair with half-closed eyes, pondering on the dreams and visions of the illustrious people Spencer had listed. I was a writer of sorts, an artist in my own particular line, I prided myself, but I had no illusions about my name living any longer than I did. 100 years hence, no one would be the slightest bit interested to learn that I had died in a madhouse or had regular bouts of delirium tremens. For some time, my mind dwelt upon the ephemerality of the second-rate writer's little fame, and then began to work in its usual way of putting 2 ideas together and fashioning from them something fresh. The slow shaping of a new story about a brilliant writer who went mad at the height of his fame went on in my imagination. I was lost in it. Detachedly, I became aware that the illumination of the room appeared to be slowly changing in its quality. The normal yellowy-white light of the oil lamp was taking on a faint tinge of green. I was still deep in abstraction, and paid little heed to it at first, but presently it became so pronounced that I took an absent-minded look at the lamp. It was very low. I remembered in a vague sort of way that I had forgotten to get any more paraffin. The greenish light was coming from somewhere on my left, where the window was, and I thought it was some queer effect of the moonlight shining in. I glanced over at the window, and my heart gave a bound that I thought had displaced it. A sort of silent screaming horror held me paralyzed. The window was a square of greenly translucent light, as though it were the side of an artificially illuminated aquarium. and glaring through it at me was William Blake's nightmare vision of the devil. The eyes burned into mine, the fangs were revealed in a tiger's grin. The whole effect was that of a monster aflame with sadistic appetite, measuring its distance for a pounce at my throat. I'm afraid I fainted. It's a weakness no man likes to admit to, but it does happen. It happened to me, and I'm very thankful that it did. When I came to, the oil lamp was but a mere glimmer, reflected like a star in the black opacity of the window before me. For there was no trace left of my frightful visitant. The night outside was as dark as a cavern deep in the earth, and no shape of anything, not even the adjacent pines, could be discerned. I got up, shaking like an ancient car, and had to lean on the table for a few moments while I cured my knees of their curious tendency to give. Then, in a trembling but swift manner, I became urgent with action. First, I slammed home the bolts of the door. I didn't know why the thing hadn't come in after me that way, but I wasn't going to give it the advantage of any second thoughts. Then I pulled the thick curtain over the window. I was afraid to go near the window to do this. I might suddenly find myself literally face to face with the thing, and I didn't think my heart would stand it. So I hooked the curtain over with the end of a broomstick, and I was holding myself well away from the other end of it. Then I laid the poker on the table, ready for emergencies. It was a comfortably heavy length of iron. And then I had a couple of neat whiskeys. There was nothing I could do about the lamp. There wasn't any more oil, and I wasn't going out to search for any at this time of night. The very thought of feeling about among the unseen trees out there again made me shudder. I found a stub of candle and lit it, but it wasn't going to last long. So I built a huge fire. On that sultry summer night I had a blaze going that near melted me, but I didn't mind feeling warm, so long as I could feel more secure. And bright firelight was a sight better than absolute darkness. I sat close by the fire, streaming with sweat, my poker at hand, and I resolved not to let that light fail, nor myself sleep until dawn and the blessed daylight came. My eye fell on Spencer's letter on the table. I had had enough of that sort of thing. I reached over and grabbed it, and was about to drop it into the fire, when I noticed for the first time a diagram traced on the back of it. It was a pentagram, executed with extremely neat draftsmanship in very thin lines of what appeared to be green ink. As I studied it, it seemed to stand out from the paper, as though it were embossed, and then the paper appeared to fade away from around it, leaving the pentagram like a green wire frame. And the wire began to glow until the center of my vision was nothing but a blankness in which the pentagram glowed like a green neon sign, which grew bigger and bigger. The friendly firelight was being blotted out, and now there were faces, grinning and leering faces pressing all about me, an increasing crowd, and a green light brightening and glowing over everything. The last dwindling remnant of my will just managed to snap the spell, like wrenching oneself out of the hypnosis of a nightmare. And in that snap, the horrors vanished, and there I was, sitting in the firelight with just an ordinary piece of paper in my hand. But not for long. In a spasm of fear and rage, I screwed it into a ball and threw it into the heart of the fire. There was a brief spurt of green flame. It might have been a pinch of some chemical in one of the logs. I stayed awake all night, but I was not troubled further by visions. In the morning, I packed my things and fled back to London. Dear old dirty, but safe Bloomsbury, with the shabby temple of the British Museum, and the little streets full of foreign dining rooms and bookshops, and the captive trees in the grimy squares. As soon as I had got resettled in my apartment, I marched round to Mecklenburgh Square to demand of Spencer what the hell. Though callers for him were few and far between, he had fitted a Yale lock to the door of his big bed sitting room at the top of the grey house, and he kept the door shut and himself on the other side of it. But he had long trusted me with a key. I got no answer when I knocked, so I let myself in. There was his desk in the far corner, littered with books and papers as usual, and there was his old-fashioned wing armchair, in which he spent more time asleep than in his bed, but there was no sign of him. Of course, he might be doing some research in the museum reading room. On the other hand, he might be out eating in one of the neighboring cafes. I presumed he did eat sometimes, though I had never seen him at it. But those were the only reasons that I could imagine would ever take him out of this room. He took no exercise and had no use for fresh air. How he managed to find the oxygen to breathe in this place I could never understand. The door and window were always shut. I walked over to and had a struggle with the window, but it was quite immovable, Through years of neglect, window and frame had amalgamated. I sat myself in his armchair, glancing idly about the room. Every available wall space, from floor to ceiling, was taken up with laden bookshelves, the famous library on the black arts, demonology, spiritualism, and every aspect of the supernatural. There was his large double bed in the corner, unmade as always, its tangled clothes draping down on the carpet. The stained old coffee pot stood on the hearth, and there were cigarette stubs thrown anywhere about the floor. Standing like a rock in the sea of documents, letters, files, clippings, pamphlets, and allied paper matter which flowed over the desk was Spencer's typewriter. There was a sheet of paper in it, half filled with typescript. Curious to learn what Spencer was working on now, I got up and had a look at it. I found it was page 4 of a letter obviously addressed to me, so I looked on the desk for the previous sheets and found them. As far as the letter went, I read it with absorption. Dear Bill, I suppose when this reaches you, you will be cursing me for a sleepless night. Probably you will have found the immediate cause of it. If not, this letter will enlighten you, so that you can destroy the said cause and sleep the sleep of the innocent. Consider the humble pentagram. It's become a jolly little figure of fun now, good luck and all that sort of thing. You might get it in the form of a lucky charm from a Christmas cracker, or see a dozen of it representing stars in the illustrations to children's fairy story books. Businessmen who like playing at secret societies, which are also good for business, use it for a secret recognition symbol between one member and another. They copied that trick from the Pythagoreans. But the Pythagoreans were alive to the dread secret they shared, and which they kept from the ordinary people. Yet even these philosopher geometricians were a bit astray upon one point. Because they trace manifestations to the presence of a pentagram of a certain size and shape, they thought that the secret lay in that certain size and shape, and certainly the same effects were brought about through using exact duplicates of that original pentagram. But the whole secret really lies in just one triangle of that figure. The surface size is irrelevant, and the rest of the pentagram frame redundant. It's the angles of that one triangle which are important. Fashion a triangle with its 3 angles of sizes I could give you, though an error amounting to a second will suffice to make it impotent, and you will have a triangle of terror indeed. I'll tell you that one angle is 36 degrees, 47 minutes, 29 seconds, if you want to play games with trial and error. When you hit upon the right one and leave it about, you'll start seeing things sooner or later. But your chances are small. It is not an isosceles triangle, but a scalene. The original pentagram was a very rough effort, far from symmetrical, and only by a fluke did it contain this dangerous triangle. How did I discover all this? It began with my investigation of the haunting of a cottage in Norfolk. I connected the phenomena with a small glass prism which had been lying about the place. The former occupant was a spectroscopist, until he went mad and was put away. On a couple of occasions when the spooks were about to appear, I noticed that this prism took on a palely translucent quality of green. Proceeding according to scientific method, I found that the cottage was not haunted if the prism was taken away from it. But the vicinity of the prism was, wherever one took it. I had a rather unpleasant time discovering that. I must tell you about it sometime. Unfortunately, I dropped the prism one day and broke a corner off, and it was never the same again. It became just another piece of glass, but I had taken exact measurements of it, and I kept them. Years later, I traced, by exhaustive trial and error, the cause of another haunting, in a residential house on Putney Common, to the presence of all things, a paper fastener, a triangular one. I took careful measurements of this, and compared them with the dimensions of that remembered prism. I knew I had hit upon something when I found that its angles, though not the area enclosed by them, corresponded absolutely exactly with the angles of one of the naturally triangular ends of the prism, the end I had broken. I'm afraid I didn't keep my evidence long. I was so troubled by dreams and visions as long as it was in my possession that I was finally driven to bending it out of shape. That made it harmless, a simple little action like that. But I found plenty of confirmatory evidence. That haunted riverside bungalow at Teddington, I removed and destroyed one of those common triangular shelf brackets and got the credit for exorcising the spirits. Do you know why Burlham Rectory is still known as the most haunted house in Britain? Because I couldn't get permission to attack a beam completing a triangle out of one of the gables. I tell you, you've only got to look around any of these haunted houses and know what you're looking for, and you'll find the cause of the trouble sooner or later. It may be a fortuitous triangle of scratches on the wall, a coat hanger, or even the side of a pepper pot, but it's always there. When I was making researches into the history of the Pythagoreans, I found the secret was known to them centuries before the time of Christ, only they mistook the pentagram for the cause, and not just the triangle contained therein. They used to practice the rites of raising these unpleasant apparitions, and then conquering them by destroying the sign. They felt purified by the struggle with evil, and uplifted by the symbolic victory over it. I'm not sure, though, that they always had the victory. Naturally, they kept these dark secrets from common men, but the people gradually got wind of it, feared and hated them as sorcerers, and tried to expunge them. The persecution reached its height in the middle of the 5th century BC. Everywhere the meeting houses of the Pythagoreans were burned down, and any Pythagoreans found there slain. You're probably wondering why a particular kind of triangle should cause such phenomena anyway. So am I. I'm still investigating. My own theory at the moment goes like this. Firstly, these devils and demons which appear have no material existence, and in fact, no existence at all, outside your own mind. They exist in our unconscious mind, memories we are born with, handed down from our most primitive ancestors. Do you remember when you were a child, alone in your own bedroom, trying to sleep? Those uneasy times when you imagined you saw faces, nasty, glare-eyed, frightening faces, in the darkness of your room. And when you shut your eyes to escape them, there they were behind your eyelids, clearer than ever. They are the things our terror dreams are built upon. Children see them more than we do, for the imagination is so much more active in childhood. In adults, it gradually grows moribund, and we become creatures of habit. But very sensitive and imaginative people, who live more in their unconscious mind than their conscious one, the introverts, still see them. Very sensitive and imaginative people, I repeat, like artists, poets, composers, like Blake, Shelley, Schumann. You begin to get the idea, the music makers, and the dreamers of dreams. Far more strongly than extroverted, materialistic people. I can't imagine those businessmen having much trouble with their pentagrams, even if by a remote chance they hit upon a Pythagorean one. They react to this touchstone of a triangle. It acts as a sort of gateway through which seep ever more strongly the images and waves of the unconscious, until they flood over and submerge the conscious mind altogether. And when that happens to a man, we say he is mad. The conscious mind weighs and judges. It is our critical faculty. It keeps us in balanced relation to the material world. But when it is gone, we are helpless. We will believe in anything that our unconscious mind believes in, for that wholly possesses us now. Why haven't all great men, like Beethoven, Shakespeare, Da Vinci, gone mad? Why only a small proportion? I anticipate your questions. Well, simply because they never happened to come into juxtaposition with one of these triangles. But the ones I have listed, and many others that I have not, must have had that triangle somewhere about their houses. Or, quite conceivably, within their own physical body, a bone structure or vein formation, or some such freak effect. It seems that physical vision of the triangle is not necessary. Extrasensory perception is pretty firmly established, and I am inclined to believe that the design is perceived extrasensorily if it is close at hand. It seems to exert a hypnotic effect on the subject's mind, but in just what manner is yet to be discovered. What are thought waves anyway, and may not they react only against certain designs, as a certain design of antennae is needed to catch television waves? Come to that, what is imagination? It is because you are a writer, and therefore have some amount of imagination, that I sent you my little puzzle, and pentagram. It should have had some amusing results. However, I don't think they will have been harmful. I had read your books and assessed the quality of your imagination, and I don't think you need fear the fate of the writers I have mentioned. After all, once you fully realize that these phantoms only emerge from your own mind, it should... The letter ended there, in mid-sentence, which I thought a little odd. This was the first I had heard of Spencer carrying out practical investigation of hauntings. Any sort of action seemed so unlike him. Had he been called away to one now, I wondered. If Spencer had judged the quality of my imagination solely from my books, he was at fault. I'm not nearly so matter-of-fact as the style of those books suggests. That style is a pose, to cover up an almost morbid sensitivity. I may not be as highly strung as were any of the writers Spencer had listed, but I certainly didn't think last night's results amusing, and I shouldn't have liked to predict the outcome if I hadn't destroyed the pentagram in time. No, when Spencer returned, he was going to find that in me he had reaped a whirlwind. Meanwhile, I would give him another half hour before I went and had lunch. I sat down, pondering upon the incredible revelations of the letter, yet from my independent experience I could not doubt the truth of them. I wondered whether it was possible to cure cases of madness caused that way. There was a chance of... At that moment I caught sight of something that sent an electric shock through me. The sole of a shoe, just under Spencer's large bed, partially hidden by the carelessly flung bedclothes. And this sole was balancing upright on its toe, a position impossible unless that shoe contained a human foot. There was somebody lying face downwards under the bed. I had to force myself to go over and investigate. It was Spencer, as I had feared, and he was dead. He had forced himself under the bed as far as his bulk would allow, and I had a strenuous time getting him out. There was a sort of horrible ludicrousness about those efforts. But when I saw his face, I didn't think there was anything in the least funny about it. Both mouth and eyes were wide open. Something about the countenance reminded me of the cast in the Pompeii Museum, of the poor unfortunate who was suffocated in terror beneath the ashes of the eruption which buried his city. And the irises of the eyes were turned slightly in and upwards, like those of a man in an apoplectic fit. It was a ghastly effect. And I knew he had been seeking refuge in a blinding animal fear from something which had literally scared the life out of him. Poor Spencer! What an impossible and ridiculous refuge he had flown to. What awful presence had unbalanced such a scholarly mind, broken such a firm character, made a tragic clown out of such a mature and wise man. Of course, according to his own theory, he would be very susceptible to these frightening visions from the unconscious, because he lived so largely in the recesses of his own mind, and was usually more than semi-oblivious to his surroundings and his company. Yes, his own discovery must have destroyed him. And then I was struck by an appalling realization. This couldn't have happened without the imminent presence of that terrible triangle. It must still be somewhere about, in all probability somewhere in this room. If I weren't careful... Panic thoughts chased about in my brain. I attempted to get a grip upon myself. I stood up. It was quite obvious what I must do. I must go straight away and inform the police. Was that something moving over there by the door? Whether it was or not, fear suddenly closed in upon my soul. I felt sick in the stomach, and my whole body began to tremble. A secondary reaction from last night's horror show joined forces with the shocks of these fresh discoveries. Images of the triangle I feared kept trying to shape in my too lively imagination. I fought to keep it out of my mind. I must get out of here, I must get out of here, I was muttering to myself. I essayed a rather shaky step towards the door, and then stopped with an indrawn gasp as though a bucket of very cold water had been thrown over me. Between the door and myself stood a tall, yet slightly hunched creature out of the worst of my childhood nightmares. A mad, drooling thing, with a face rotten with corruption, with dead, blinkless eyes that seemed to be gazing past me, and yet I knew that they were not. In reality, the thing's whole attention was upon me. But it was not an intelligent attention. It was the unthinking, unreflecting, but blindly eager attention of the slavering and snuffling village idiot who slowly and deliberately pulls the legs off a spider or takes a knife to a captive sparrow and works unimaginable cruelties upon it. And this thing was after me. Cold sweat broke out upon me. My conscious mind was hammering away. It isn't real, it won't hurt you. It's just your own imagination. You're becoming hypnotized. Break the spell, look away. I dragged my eyes from it, and my gaze fell full upon Spencer lying dead at my feet, on his back, his queer eyes seeming to strive to see his own forehead. With a sob, I stumbled across him and gained the fireplace. I clung to the mantel shelf, still keeping my gaze averted from the direction of the door. The stained coffee pot on the hearth was looking up at me. It had become a face, with a grotesque spout of a nose. It was one of the leering faces I had seen last night. With a quite uncalculated action, like a reflex kick, I lifted it violently with the toe of my shoe, and it went smashing into fragments against the farther wall. That was an unexpected relief. In sudden hope, I dared a glance towards the door. But the slobbering, staring thing was as real and as potentially murderous as ever. It had advanced considerably towards me, and now I could see details of it that I wished I could not. Its dead white hands were reaching out ready to clutch and grip. It seemed inexorably sure of itself, and adding to my terror, it moved with absolute soundlessness. If it breathed, I could not hear it. It approached me like an image from an old silent film, a moving shadow. "It is a shadow," said one part of my mind. "Only a shadow that you're throwing." And another voice was shouting, "The window! Escape by the window!" And another voice was saying, "The window is jammed, you can't open it." My mind was a roaring confusion of divided impulses, all overridden by the dominating rush of fear. I knew that it was disintegrating, that my conscious mind was going to pieces under the strain, and when that salivating horror got me, I should go screaming mad, as others had gone mad. I made one last desperate effort to clear a space in that chaos in which to think connectedly. The triangle. This was all happening through the medium of the triangle. I must find it. There was not a moment to lose. I must destroy it. Quick, where? What could it be? Was it a bracket of that pipe rack? I tore it down and smashed it. But without looking, I knew that I was still pursued. God, there were 1,000 things in this room that might contain it. I went through a brief fury of breaking every suspicious thing I could lay my hands upon within my limited radius. But still I was forced to retreat until I was pressing against the desk in the far corner from the door, and shaking like a paralytic, I could retreat no further. I think I was beginning to scream voicelessly as I scrabbled in mad desperation among the books and papers on the desk, my eyes literally bulging with anxiety in their baffled search for something triangular. In one convulsive sweep, I shot a whole heap of the clutter from the desk. It revealed the blotting pad that pile had covered. In the center of the blotting pad was a familiar outline in green ink, the pentagram. I knew it was what I sought. I pounced on it like a wild animal and ripped it across, and ripped again. Then I turned around, weakly, with the pieces in my hand. The thing which had almost had its fingers on my throat was gone. I began to chuckle feebly, and kept tearing the blotting pad across and across again, tossing the small pieces in the air. They fluttered to the floor like a miniature staged snowstorm. Like Wellington after Waterloo, I kept saying to myself, "A near-run thing, a near-run thing." And all because of the fact that when old Spencer had drawn so carefully that representation of the pentagram he sent me, he had blotted it on his pad, and never noticed that he had left a perfect reproduction of those dangerous angles among his papers. That was his undoing. I suppose he was frightened to death. The doctor diagnosed coronary thrombosis, and the coroner saw fit to agree with him. Sometimes these days I catch myself trying to agree with him too. It is human to rationalize. But I do know that I am never, under any conditions, going to play about with any triangles that include one angle of 36 degrees, 47 minutes, and 29 seconds. In fact, I am allergic to triangles of any kind. When Carson first noticed the sounds in his cellar, he ascribed them to the rats. Later, he began to hear the tales which were whispered by the superstitious Polish mill workers in Derby Street regarding the first occupant of the ancient house, Abigail Prynne. There was none living today who could remember the diabolical old hag, but the morbid legends which thrive in the witch district of Salem like rank weeds on a neglected grave gave disturbing particulars of her activities, and were unpleasantly explicit regarding the detestable sacrifices she was known to have made to a worm-eaten, crescent-horned image of dubious origin. The oldsters still muttered of Abby Prynne, and her monstrous boasts that she was high priestess of a fearfully potent god which dwelt deep in the hills. Indeed, it was the old witch's reckless boasting which had led to her abrupt and mysterious death in 1692, about the time of the famous hangings on Gallows Hill. No one liked to talk about it, but occasionally a toothless crone would mumble fearfully that the flames could not burn her, for her whole body had taken on the peculiar anesthesia of her witch mark. Abby Prynne and her anomalous statue had long since vanished, but it was still difficult to find tenants for her decrepit gabled house, with its overhanging second story and curious diamond-paned casement windows. The house's evil notoriety had spread throughout Salem. Nothing had actually happened there of recent years which might give rise to the inexplicable tales, but those who rented the house had a habit of moving out hastily, generally with vague and unsatisfactory explanations connected with the rats. And it was a rat which led Carson to the witch room. The squealing and muffled pattering within the rotting walls had disturbed Carson more than once during the nights of his first week in the house, which he had rented to obtain the solitude that would enable him to complete a novel for which his publishers had been asking. Another light romance to add to Carson's long string of popular successes. But it was not until some time later that he began to entertain certain wildly fantastic surmises regarding the intelligence of the rat that scurried from under his feet in the dark hallway one evening. The house had been wired for electricity, but the bulb in the hall was small and gave a dim light. The rat was a misshapen black shadow as it darted a few feet away and paused, apparently watching him. At another time, Carson might have dismissed the animal with a threatening gesture and returned to his work. But the traffic on Derby Street had been unusually noisy, and he had found it difficult to concentrate upon his novel. His nerves, for no apparent reason, were taut, and somehow it seemed that the rat, watching just beyond his reach, was eyeing him with sardonic amusement. Smiling at the conceit, he took a few steps toward the rat, and it rushed away to the cellar door, which he saw with surprise was ajar. He must have neglected to close it the last time he had been in the cellar, although he generally took care to keep the doors shut, for the ancient house was draughty. The rat waited in the doorway. Unreasonably annoyed, Carson hurried forward, sending the rat scurrying down the stairway. He switched on the cellar light and observed the rat in a corner. It watched him keenly out of glittering little eyes. As he descended the stairs, he could not help feeling that he was acting like a fool. But his work had been tiring, and subconsciously he welcomed any interruption. He moved across the cellar to the rat, seeing with astonishment that the creature remained unmoving, staring at him. A strange feeling of uneasiness began to grow within him. The rat was acting abnormally, he felt, and the unwinking gaze of its cold shoe-button eyes was somehow disturbing. Then he laughed to himself, for the rat had suddenly whisked aside and disappeared into a little hole in the cellar wall. Idly, he scratched a cross with his toe in the dirt before the burrow, deciding that he would set a trap there in the morning. The rat's snout and ragged whiskers protruded cautiously. It moved forward and then hesitated, drew back. Then the animal began to act in a singular and unaccountable manner, almost as though it were dancing, Carson thought. It moved tentatively forward, retreated again. It would give a little dart forward and be brought up short, then leap back hastily, as though, the simile flashed into Carson's mind, a snake were coiled before the burrow, alert to prevent the rat's escape. But there was nothing there, save the little cross Carson had scratched in the dust. No doubt it was Carson himself who blocked the rat's escape, for he was standing within a few feet of the burrow. He moved forward, and the animal hurriedly retreated out of sight. His interest piqued, Carson found a stick and poked it exploringly into the hole. As he did so, his eye, close to the wall, detected something strange about the stone slab just above the rat burrow. A quick glance around its edge confirmed his suspicion. The slab was apparently movable. Carson examined it closely, noticed a depression on its edge which would afford a handhold. His fingers fitted easily into the groove, and he pulled tentatively. The stone moved a trifle and stopped. He pulled harder, and with a sprinkling of dry earth, the slab swung away from the wall, as though on hinges. A black rectangle, shoulder high, gaped in the wall. From its depths, a musty, unpleasant stench of dead air welled out, and involuntarily Carson retreated a step. Suddenly he remembered the monstrous tales of Abby Prynne and the hideous secrets she was supposed to have kept hidden in her house. Had he stumbled upon some hidden retreat of the long-dead witch? Before entering the dark gap, he took the precaution of obtaining a flashlight from upstairs. Then he cautiously bent his head and stepped into the narrow, evil-smelling passage, sending the flashlight's beam probing out before him. He was in a narrow tunnel, scarcely higher than his head, and walled and paved with stone slabs. It ran straight ahead for perhaps 15 feet, and then broadened out into a roomy chamber. As Carson stepped into the underground room, no doubt a hidden retreat of Abby Prynne's, a hiding place, he thought, which nevertheless could not save her on the day the fright-crazed mob had come raging along Derby Street, he caught his breath in a gasp of amazement. The room was fantastic, astonishing. It was the floor which held Carson's gaze. The dull gray of the circular wall gave place here to a mosaic of varicolored stone, in which blues and greens and purples predominated, Indeed, there were none of the warmer colors. There must have been thousands of bits of colored stone making up that pattern, for none was larger than a walnut. And the mosaic seemed to follow some definite pattern, unfamiliar to Carson. There were curves of purple and violet mingled with angled lines of green and blue, intertwining in fantastic arabesques. There were circles, triangles, a pentagram, and other less familiar figures. Most of the lines and figures radiated from a definite point, the center of the chamber, where there was a circular disc of dead black stone, perhaps 2 feet in diameter. It was very silent. The sounds of the cars that occasionally went past overhead in Derby Street could not be heard. In a shallow alcove in the wall, Carson caught a glimpse of markings on the walls, and he moved slowly in that direction, the beam of his light traveling up and down the walls of the niche. The marks, whatever they were, had been daubed upon the stone long ago, for what was left of the cryptic symbols was indecipherable. Carson saw several partly effaced hieroglyphics, which reminded him of Arabic, but he could not be sure. On the floor of the alcove was a corroded metal disc about 8 feet in diameter, and Carson received the distinct impression that it was movable, but there seemed no way to lift it. He became conscious that he was standing in the exact center of the chamber, in the circle of black stone where the odd design centered. Again, he noticed the utter silence. On an impulse, he clicked off the ray of his flashlight. Instantly, he was in dead blackness. At that moment, a curious idea entered his mind. He pictured himself at the bottom of a pit, and from above a flood was descending, pouring down the shaft to engulf him. So strong was this impression that he actually fancied he could hear a muffled thundering, the roar of the cataract. Then, oddly shaken, he clicked on the light, glanced around swiftly. The drumming, of course, was the pounding of his blood, made audible in the complete silence, a familiar phenomenon. But if the place was so still... The thought leaped into his mind, as though suddenly thrust into his consciousness. This would be an ideal place to work. He could have the place wired for electricity, have a table and chair brought down, use an electric fan if necessary, although the musty odor he had first noticed seemed to have disappeared completely. He moved to the tunnel mouth, and as he stepped from the room, he felt an inexplicable relaxation of his muscles, although he had not realized that they had been contracted. He ascribed it to nervousness, and went upstairs to brew black coffee, and write to his landlord in Boston about his discovery. The visitor stared curiously about the hallway after Carson had opened the door, nodding to himself as though with satisfaction. He was a lean, tall figure of a man, with thick steel-gray eyebrows overhanging keen gray eyes. His face, although strongly marked and gaunt, was unwrinkled. "About the witch room, I suppose?" Carson said ungraciously. His landlord had talked, and for the last week he had been unwillingly entertaining antiquaries and occultists, anxious to glimpse the secret chamber in which Abby Prynne had mumbled her spells. Carson's annoyance had grown, and he had considered moving to a quieter place, but his inherent stubbornness had made him stay on, determined to finish his novel in spite of interruptions. Now, eyeing his guest coldly, he said, "I'm sorry, but it's not on exhibition anymore." The other looked startled, but almost immediately a gleam of comprehension came into his eyes. He extracted a card and offered it to Carson. "Michael Lee, occultist, eh?" Carson repeated. He drew a deep breath. The occultists, he had found, were the worst, with their dark hints of nameless things, and their profound interest in the mosaic pattern on the floor of the witch room. "I'm sorry, Mr. Lee, but I'm really quite busy. You'll excuse me." Ungraciously, he turned back to the door. "Just a moment," Lee said swiftly. Before Carson could protest, he had caught the writer by the shoulders and was peering closely into his eyes. Startled, Carson drew back, but not before he had seen an extraordinary expression of mingled apprehension and satisfaction appear on Lee's gaunt face. It was as though the occultist had seen something unpleasant, but not unexpected. "What's the idea?" Carson asked harshly. "I'm not accustomed—" "I'm very sorry," Lee said. His voice was deep and pleasant. "I must apologize. I thought... Well, again, I apologize. I'm rather excited, I'm afraid. You see, I've come from San Francisco to see this witch room of yours. Would you really mind letting me see it? I should be glad to pay any sum." Carson made a deprecatory gesture. "No," he said, feeling a perverse liking for this man growing within him, his well-modulated, pleasant voice, his powerful face, his magnetic personality. No, I merely want a little peace. You have no idea how I've been bothered, he went on, vaguely surprised to find himself speaking apologetically. It's a frightful nuisance. I almost wish I'd never found the room. Lee leaned forward anxiously. May I see it? It means a great deal to me. I'm vitally interested in these things. I promise not to take up more than 10 minutes of your time. Carson hesitated, then assented. As he led his guest into the cellar, he found himself telling the circumstances of his discovery of the witch room. Lee listened intently, occasionally interrupting with questions. The rat, did you see what became of it? He asked. Carson looked bemused. Why, no, I suppose it hid in its burrow. Why? One never knows, Lee said cryptically as they came into the witch room. Carson switched on the light. He had had an electrical extension installed, and there were a few chairs and a table, but otherwise the chamber was unchanged. Carson watched the occultist's face, and with surprise saw it becoming grim, almost angry. Lee strode to the center of the room, staring at the chair that stood on the black circle of stone. You work here? He asked slowly. Yes, it's quiet. I found I couldn't work upstairs, too noisy. But this is ideal. Somehow I find it very easy to write here. My mind feels... He hesitated. Free. That is, disassociated with other things. It's quite an unusual feeling. Lee nodded as though Carson's words had confirmed some idea in his own mind. He turned toward the alcove and the metal disc in the floor. Carson followed him. The occultist moved close to the wall, tracing out the faded symbols with a long forefinger. He muttered something under his breath, words that sounded like gibberish to Carson.
Niota Kiyanak.
He swung about, his face grim and pale. I've seen enough, he said softly. Shall we go? Surprised, Carson nodded and led the way back into the cellar. Upstairs, Lee hesitated, as though finding it difficult to broach the subject. At length he asked, Mr. Carson, would you mind telling me if you've had any peculiar dreams lately? Carson stared at him, mirth dancing in his eyes. Dreams? He repeated. Oh, I see. Well, Mr. Lee, I may as well tell you that you can't frighten me. Your compatriots, the other occultists I've entertained, have already tried it. Lee raised his thick eyebrows. Yes? Did they ask you whether you'd dreamed? Several did, yes. And you told them? No. Then, as Lee leaned back in his chair, a puzzled expression on his face, Carson went on slowly. Although, really, I'm not quite sure. You mean... I think I have a vague impression that I have dreamed lately, but I can't be sure. I can't remember anything of the dream, you see. And, oh, very probably your brother occultist put the idea into my mind. Perhaps, Lee said noncommittally, getting up. He hesitated. Mr. Carson, I'm going to ask you a rather presumptuous question. Is it necessary for you to live in this house? Carson sighed resignedly. When I was first asked that question, I explained that I wanted a quiet place to work on a novel, and that any quiet place would do, but it isn't easy to find them. Now that I have this witch room and I'm turning out my work so easily, I see no reason why I should move and perhaps upset my program. I'll vacate this house when I finish my novel, and then you occultists can come in and turn it into a museum or do whatever you want with it. I don't care. But until the novel is finished, I intend to stay here. Lee rubbed his chin. Indeed. I can't understand your point of view, but is there no other place in the house where you can work? He watched Carson's face for a moment, and then went on swiftly. I don't expect you to believe me. You're a materialist, most people are. But there are a few of us who know that above and beyond what men call science, there is a greater science that is built on laws and principles which to the average man would be almost incomprehensible. If you've read Machen, you will remember that he speaks of the gulf between the world of consciousness and the world of matter. It is possible to bridge that gulf. The witch room is such a bridge. Do you know what a whispering gallery is? Eh? Carson said, staring. But there's no... An analogy, merely an analogy. A man may whisper a word in a gallery or a cave, and if you're standing in a certain spot 100 feet away, you will hear that whisper, although someone 10 feet away will not. It's a simple trick of acoustics, bringing the sound to a focal point. And this principle can be applied to other things besides sound, to any wave impulse, even to thought. Carson tried to interrupt, but Lee kept on. That black stone in the center of your witch room is one of those focal points. The design on the floor, when you sit on the black circle there, you are abnormally sensitive to certain vibrations, certain thought commands, Dangerously sensitive. Why do you suppose your mind is so clear when you're working there? A deception, a false feeling of lucidity. For you are merely an instrument, a microphone, tuned to pick up certain malign vibrations, the nature of which you could not comprehend. Carson's face was a study in amazement and incredulity. But you don't mean you actually believe? Lee drew back, the intensity fading from his eyes, leaving them grim and cold. Very well, but I have studied the history of your Abigail Prynne. She too understood the superscience of which I speak. She used it for evil purposes, the black art, as it is called. I've read that she cursed Salem in the old days, and a witch's curse can be a frightful thing. Will you? He got up, gnawing at his lip. Will you at least allow me to call on you tomorrow? Almost involuntarily, Carson nodded. But I'm afraid you'll be wasting your time. I don't believe... I have no... He stumbled, at a loss for words. I merely wish to assure myself that you... Oh, another thing. If you dream tonight, will you try to remember the dream? If you attempt to recapture it immediately after waking, it is often possible to recall it. All right, if I dream. That night, Carson dreamed. He awoke just before dawn with his heart racing furiously, and a curious feeling of uneasiness. Within the walls and from below, he could hear the furtive scurryings of the rats. He got out of bed hastily, shivering in the cold grayness of early morning. A wan moon still shone faintly in a paling sky. Then he remembered Lee's words. He had dreamed, there was no question of that. But the content of his dream, that was another matter. He absolutely could not recall it to his mind, much as he tried, although there was a very vague impression of running frantically in darkness. He dressed quickly, and because the stillness of early morning in the old house got on his nerves, he went out to buy a newspaper. It was too early for shops to be open, however, and in search of a newsboy he set off westward, turning at the first corner. And as he walked, a curious and inexplicable feeling began to take possession of him, a feeling of familiarity. He had walked here before, and there was a dim and disturbing familiarity about the shapes of the houses, the outline of the roofs. But, and this was the fantastic part of it, to his knowledge he had never been on this street before. He had spent little time walking about this region of Salem, for he was indolent by nature, yet there was this extraordinary feeling of remembrance, and it grew more vivid as he went on. He reached a corner, turned unthinkingly to the left. The odd sensation increased. He walked on slowly, pondering. No doubt he had traveled by this way before, and very probably he had done so in a moody daydream, so that he had not been conscious of his route. Undoubtedly that was the explanation. Yet as Carson turned into Charter Street, he felt a nameless unease waking within him. Salem was rousing. With daylight, impassive Polish workers began to hurry past him toward the mills. An occasional automobile went by. Before him, a crowd was gathered on the sidewalk. He hastened his steps, conscious of a feeling of impending calamity. With an extraordinary sense of shock, he saw that he was passing the Charter Street burying ground, the ancient, evilly famous burying point. Hastily, he pushed his way into the crowd. Comments in a muffled undertone came to Carson's ears, and a bulky, blue-clad back loomed up before him. He peered over the policeman's shoulder and caught his breath in a horrified gasp. A man leaned against the iron railing that fenced the old graveyard. He wore a cheap, gaudy suit, and he gripped the rusty bars in a clutch that made his muscles stand out in ridges on the hairy backs of his hands. He was dead, and on his face, staring up at the sky at a crazy angle, was frozen an expression of abysmal and utterly shocking horror. His eyes, all whites, were bulging hideously. His mouth was a twisted, mirthless grin. A man at Carson's side turned a white face toward him. "Looks as if he was scared to death," he said, somewhat hoarsely. "I'd hate to have seen what he saw. Look at that face." Mechanically, Carson backed away, feeling an icy breath of nameless things chill him. He rubbed his hands across his eyes, but still that contorted dead face swam in his vision. He began to retrace his steps, shaken and trembling a little. Involuntarily, his glance moved aside, rested on the tombs and monuments that dotted the old graveyard. No one had been buried there for over a century, and the lichen-stained tombstones, with their winged skulls, fat-cheeked cherubs, and funeral urns, seemed to breathe out an indefinable miasma of antiquity. What had frightened the man to death? Carson drew a deep breath. True, the corpse had been a frightful spectacle, but he must not allow it to upset his nerves. He could not. His novel would suffer. Besides, he argued grimly to himself, the affair was obvious enough in its explanation. The dead man was apparently a Pole, one of the group of immigrants who dwell about Salem Harbor. Passing by the graveyard at night, a spot about which eldritch legends had clung for nearly 3 centuries, his drink-befuddled eyes must have given reality to the hazy phantoms of a superstitious mind. These Poles were notoriously unstable emotionally, prone to mob hysteria and wild imaginings. The great immigrant panic of 1853, in which 3 witch houses had been burned to the ground, had grown from an old woman's confused and hysterical statement that she had seen a mysterious white-clad foreigner take off his face. What else could be expected of such people, Carson thought. Nevertheless, he remained in a nervous state, and did not return home until nearly noon. When on his arrival he found Lee, the occultist, waiting, he was glad to see the man, and invited him in with cordiality. Lee was very serious. "Did you hear about your friend Abigail Prynne?" he asked without preamble, and Carson stared, pausing in the act of siphoning charged water into a glass. After a long moment he pressed the lever, sent the liquid sizzling and foaming into the whiskey. He handed Lee the drink and took one himself, neat, before answering the question. "I don't know what you're talking about. What's she been up to?" he asked, with an air of forced levity. "I've been checking up the records," Lee said, "and I find Abigail Prynne was buried on December 14th, 1690, in the Charter Street burying ground, with a stake through her heart. What's the matter?" "Nothing," Carson said, tonelessly. Well, her grave's been opened and robbed, that's all. The stake was found uprooted nearby, and there were footprints all around the grave. Shoe prints. Did you dream last night, Carson?" Lee snapped out the question, his gray eyes hard. "I don't know," Carson said confusedly, rubbing his forehead. "I can't remember. I was at the Charter Street graveyard this morning." "Oh, then you must have heard something about the man who—" "I saw him," Carson interrupted, shuddering. "It upset me." He downed the whiskey at a gulp. Lee watched him. "Well," he said presently, "are you still determined to stay in this house?" Carson put down the glass and stood up. "Why not?" he snapped. "Is there any reason why I shouldn't?" "After what happened last night," Lee said. "After what happened? A grave was robbed. A superstitious Pole saw the robbers and died of fright. Well?" "You're trying to convince yourself," Lee said calmly. "In your heart you must know, the truth. You've become a tool in the hands of tremendous, terrible forces, Carson. For 3 centuries Abby Prynne has lain in her grave, undead, waiting for someone to fall into her trap, the witch room. Perhaps she foresaw the future when she built it, foresaw that someday someone would blunder into that hellish chamber and be caught by the trap of the mosaic pattern. It caught you, Carson, and enabled that undead horror to bridge the gulf between consciousness and matter, to get in rapport with you. Hypnotism is child's play to a being with Abigail Prynne's frightful powers. She could very easily force you to go to her grave and uproot the stake that held her captive, and then erase the memory of that act from your mind, so that you could not remember it, even as a dream." Carson was on his feet, his eyes burning with a strange light. "In God's name, man, do you know what you're saying?" Lee laughed harshly. "God's name? The devil's name, rather. The devil that menaces Salem at this moment. For Salem is in danger, terrible danger. The men and women and children of the town Abby Prynne cursed when they bound her to the stake and found they couldn't burn her. I've been going through certain secret archives this morning, and I've come to ask you, for the last time, to leave this house." "Are you through?" Carson asked coldly. "Very well. I shall stay here. You're either insane or drunk, but you can't impress me with your poppycock." "Would you leave if I offered you $1,000? Lee asked. "Or more then, 10,000. I have a considerable sum at my command." "No, damn it!" Carson snapped in a sudden blaze of anger. "All I want is to be left alone to finish my novel. I can't work anywhere else. I don't want to. I won't." "I expected this," Lee said, his voice suddenly quiet, and with a strange note of sympathy. "Man, you can't get away. You're caught in the trap, and it's too late for you to extricate yourself, so long as Abby Prynne's brain controls you through the witch room. And the worst part of it is that she can only manifest herself with your aid. She drains your life forces, Carson, feeds on you like a vampire." "You're mad," Carson said dully. "I'm afraid. That iron disc in the witch room, I'm afraid of that and what's under it. Abby Prynne served strange gods, Carson, and I read something on the wall of that alcove that gave me a hint. Have you ever heard of Niogtha?" Carson shook his head impatiently. Lee fumbled in a pocket, drew out a scrap of paper. "I copied this from a book in the Kester Library," he said, "a book called the Necronomicon, written by a man who delved so deeply into forbidden secrets that men called him mad. Read this." Carson's brows drew together as he read the excerpt. "Men know him as the Dweller in Darkness, that brother of the Old Ones called Niogtha, the thing that should not be. He can be summoned to Earth's surface through certain secret caverns and fissures, and sorcerers have seen him in Syria, and below the Black Tower of Leng. From the Thang Grotto of Tartary, he has come ravening to bring terror and destruction among the pavilions of the Great Khan. Only by the Looped Cross, by the Vakvaraj incantation, and by the Tikkun elixir may he be driven back to the nighted caverns of hidden foulness where he dwelleth." Lee met Carson's puzzled gaze calmly. "Do you understand now?" "Incantations and elixirs," Carson said, handing back the paper. "Fiddlesticks." "Far from it. That incantation and that elixir have been known to occultists and adepts for thousands of years. I've had occasion to use them myself in the past on certain occasions. And if I'm right about this thing—" He turned to the door, his lips compressed in a bloodless line. "Such manifestations have been defeated before, but the difficulty lies in obtaining the elixir. It's very hard to get. But I hope I'll be back. Can you stay out of the witch room until then?" "I'll promise nothing," Carson said. He had a dull headache, which had been steadily growing until it obtruded upon his consciousness, and he felt vaguely nauseated. "Goodbye." He saw Lee to the door and waited on the steps, with an odd reluctance to return to the house. As he watched the tall occultist hurry down the street, a woman came out of the adjoining house. She caught sight of him, and her huge breasts heaved. She burst into a shrill, angry tirade. Carson turned, staring at her with astonished eyes. His head throbbed painfully. The woman was approaching, shaking a fat fist threateningly. "Why you scare my Sarah?" she cried, her swarthy face flushed. "Why you scare her with your fool tricks?" Carson moistened his lips. "I'm sorry," he said slowly. "Very sorry. I didn't frighten your Sarah. I haven't been home all day." "What frightened her?" "The brown thing. It ran in your house," Sarah said. The woman paused, and her jaw dropped. Her eyes widened. She made a peculiar sign with her right hand, pointing her index and little fingers at Carson, while her thumb was crossed over the other fingers. "The old witch!" She retreated hastily, muttering in Polish in a frightened voice. Carson turned, went back into the house. He poured some whiskey into a tumbler, considered, and then set it aside untasted. He began to pace the floor, occasionally rubbing his forehead with fingers that felt dry and hot. Vague, confused thoughts raced through his mind. His head was throbbing and feverish. At length, he went down to the witch room. He remained there, although he did not work, for his headache was not so oppressive in the dead quiet of the underground chamber. After a time, he slept. How long he slumbered, he did not know. He dreamed of Salem, and of a dimly glimpsed gelatinous black thing that hurtled with frightful speed through the streets, a thing like an incredibly huge jet-black amoeba that pursued and engulfed men and women who shrieked and fled vainly. He dreamed of a skull face peering into his own, a withered and shrunken countenance in which only the eyes seemed alive, and they shone with a hellish and evil light. He awoke at last, sat up with a start. He was very cold. It was utterly silent. In the light of the electric bulb, the green and purple mosaic seemed to writhe and contract toward him, an illusion which disappeared as his sleep-fogged vision cleared. He glanced at his wristwatch. It was 2 o'clock. He had slept through the afternoon and the better part of the night. He felt oddly weak, and a lassitude held him motionless in his chair. The strength seemed to have been drained from him. The piercing cold seemed to strike through to his brain, but his headache was gone. His mind was very clear, expectant, as though waiting for something to happen. A movement nearby caught his eye. A slab of stone in the wall was moving. He heard a gentle grating sound, and slowly a black cavity widened from a narrow rectangle to a square. There was something crouching there in the shadow. Stark blind horror struck through Carson as the thing moved and crept forward into the light. It looked like a mummy. For an intolerable age-long second, the thought pounded frightfully at Carson's brain. It looked like a mummy. It was a skeleton-thin, parchment-brown corpse, and it looked like a skeleton with the hide of some great lizard stretched over its bones. It stirred, it crept forward, and its long nails scratched audibly against the stone. It crawled out into the witch room, its passionless face pitilessly revealed in the white light, and its eyes were gleaming with charnel life. He could see the serrated ridge of its brown shrunken back. Carson sat motionless. Abysmal horror had robbed him of the power to move. He seemed to be caught in the fetters of dream paralysis, in which the brain, an aloof spectator, is unable or unwilling to transmit the nerve impulses to the muscles. He told himself frantically that he was dreaming, that he would presently awaken. The withered horror arose. It stood upright, skeleton thin, and moved to the alcove where the iron disc lay embedded in the floor. Standing with its back to Carson, it paused, and a dry and sear whisper rustled out in the dead stillness. At the sound, Carson would have screamed, but he could not. Still, the dreadful whisper went on, in a language Carson knew was not of earth, and as though in response an almost imperceptible quiver shook the iron disc. It quivered and began to rise very slowly, and as if in triumph the shriveled horror lifted its pipe-stem arms. The disc was nearly a foot thick, but presently as it continued to rise above the level of the floor, an insidious odor began to penetrate the room. It was vaguely reptilian, musky, and nauseating. The disc lifted inexorably, and a little finger of blackness crept out from beneath its edge. Abruptly, Carson remembered his dream of a gelatinous black creature that hurtled through the Salem streets. He tried vainly to break the fetters of paralysis that held him motionless. The chamber was darkening, and a black vertigo was creeping up to engulf him. The room seemed to rock. Still the iron disc lifted, still the withered horror stood with its skeleton arms raised in blasphemous benediction, still the blackness oozed out in slow amoeboid movement. There came a sound breaking through the sear whisper of the mummy, the quick patter of racing footsteps. Out of the corner of his eye, Carson saw a man come racing into the witch room. It was the occultist, Lee, and his eyes were blazing in a face of deathly pallor. He flung himself past Carson to the alcove where the black horror was surging into view. The withered thing turned with dreadful slowness. Lee carried some implement in his left hand, Carson saw, a crux ansata of gold and ivory. His right hand was clenched at his side. His voice rolled out, sonorous and commanding. There were little beads of perspiration on his white face.
Jana hattest du nie gri, stetsnak na niota kjanak flegetha.
The fantastic, unearthly syllables thundered out, echoing from the walls of the vault. Lee advanced slowly, the crux ansata held high. And from beneath the iron disc, black horror came surging. The disc was lifted, flung aside, and a great wave of iridescent blackness, neither liquid nor solid, a frightful gelatinous mass, came pouring straight for Lee. Without pausing in his advance, he made a quick gesture with his right hand, and a little glass tube hurtled at the black thing, was engulfed. The formless horror paused. It hesitated with a dreadful air of indecision, and then swiftly drew back. A choking stench of burning corruption began to pervade the air, and Carson saw great pieces of the black thing flake off, shriveling as though destroyed with corroding acid. It fled back in a liquescent rush, hideous black flesh dropping as it retreated. A pseudopod of blackness elongated itself from the central mass, and like a great tentacle clutched the corpse-like being, dragged it back to the pit and over the brink. Another tentacle seized the iron disc, pulled it effortlessly across the floor, and as the horror sank from sight, the disc fell into place with a thunderous crash. The room swung in wide circles about Carson, and a frightful nausea clutched him. He made a tremendous effort to get to his feet, and then the light faded swiftly and was gone. Darkness took him. Carson's novel was never finished. He burned it, but continued to write, although none of his later work was ever published. His publishers shook their heads and wondered why such a brilliant writer of popular fiction had suddenly become infatuated with the weird and ghastly. "It's powerful stuff," one man told Carson as he handed back his novel, Black God of Madness. "It's remarkable in its way, but it's morbid and horrible. Nobody would read it. Carson, why don't you write the type of novel you used to do, the kind that made you famous?" It was then that Carson broke his vow never to speak of the witch room, and he poured out the entire story, hoping for understanding and belief. But as he finished, his heart sank as he saw the other's face, sympathetic but skeptical. "You dreamed it, didn't you?" the man asked, and Carson laughed bitterly. "Yes, I dreamed it." "It must have made a terribly vivid impression on your mind. Some dreams do. But you'll forget about it in time," he predicted, and Carson nodded. And because he knew that he would only be arousing doubts of his sanity, he did not mention the thing that was burned indelibly on his brain, the horror he had seen in the witch room after wakening from his faint. Before he and Lee had hurried, white-faced and trembling from the chamber, Carson had cast a quick glance behind him. The shriveled and corroded patches that he had seen slough off from that being of insane blasphemy had unaccountably disappeared, although they had left black stains upon the stones. Abby Prynne, perhaps, had returned to the hell she had served, and her inhuman god had withdrawn to hidden abysses beyond man's comprehension, routed by powerful forces of elder magic which the occultist had commanded. But the witch had left a memento behind her, a hideous thing which Carson, in that last backward glance, had seen protruding from the edge of the iron disc, as though raised in ironic salute, a withered, claw-like hand.